Will you be working with him at that time?
No, I think we should have finished the film by then. I'll be working with him from March through the end of June or something like that.
Do you ever stop working?
Oh, God, yes. I sometimes don't do a picture for a year and a half.
On a quiet March morning in 2007, the American entertainment industry woke up to a headline that stopped people in their tracks. Hollywood Truth magazine had published a story about a discovery that nobody saw coming. A secret journal, handwritten and deeply personal, had been found among the belongings of Burt Lancaster, one of the most respected and celebrated actors of Hollywood's golden age. Lancaster was not just a famous face from films like From Here to Eternity. He was a man of genuine principle, someone who had marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement and used his public platform to stand for things that actually mattered. So when the contents of his journal became known, the shock was not just about what it contained, it was about who had written it. Lancaster had left behind not a traditional memoir full of warm reminiscences and carefully polished anecdotes, but something far more raw and deliberately unsettling. A list of 14 names. All of them were iconic figures from the same golden era of Hollywood that had made Lancaster himself a star. And next to each name, he had written his honest and unfiltered assessment of who that person truly was behind the legend. He called them, collectively, the most ruthless people Hollywood had ever produced. Not difficult personalities or complicated artists, but genuinely dangerous individuals whose public images had been constructed to hide something much darker underneath. What could have driven a man of Lancaster's reputation and moral seriousness to write something like this before his death? That question is worth sitting with as the stories unfold. Before we get into the names themselves, if you enjoy these kinds of deep dives into Hollywood's real and hidden history, the stories that the studios never wanted told, and the truth that took decades to surface, make sure you subscribe right now and turn on notifications. There is always more waiting, and you will not want to miss any of it. The first name on Lancaster's list was also the one he described as the most cruel of all, and the choice itself was striking. Kirk Douglas was, by any public measure, one of the most celebrated actors of his generation. Audiences knew him as a portrayer of bold, dazzling heroes, the kind of larger-than-life figures that seemed to embody the best of what Hollywood could offer. Lancaster had known him professionally for years, and what he wrote about him in that journal bore no resemblance to the public image. According to Lancaster, Douglas was a ruthless manipulator who had spent his entire career using every tool available to him to crush anyone who stood between him and what he wanted. He described him not as a difficult colleague, but as something closer to a predator wearing a respectable human face. The specific accusations Lancaster recorded were serious ones. Douglas was alleged to have gone far beyond the normal Hollywood power games of influencing casting decisions or pressuring producers. He reportedly used his fame and connections to punish people who refused to comply with his personal demands. One account Lancaster included involved an actress named Lisa Avery, who was removed from a major production in 1959 for no professional reason whatsoever. The real reason, according to Lancaster, was that she had declined a private dinner invitation from Douglas. That single act of refusal had cost her a significant professional opportunity, and it was, Lancaster suggested, just one example in a much longer pattern of exploitation and control that Douglas maintained throughout his career. Beyond that, Lancaster alleged that Douglas used illegal substances as instruments of manipulation, distributing them strategically to keep directors, producers, and co-stars in a position of dependency and compliance. Anyone who resisted, Lancaster wrote, faced consequences that ranged from being quietly removed from projects to being placed in situations where speaking out felt genuinely dangerous. The second name was Natalie Wood, and the account Lancaster left about her was disturbing in a different way. Wood had been one of the most beloved actresses of her era, remembered for her delicate beauty and the particular quality of sadness her eyes seemed to carry even in her happiest roles. Lancaster's portrait of her was almost nothing like that public image. He described her as a sharp and calculating manipulator who used the perception of fragility as a tool to get what she wanted from the people around her. According to his journal, she once set out deliberately to have a fellow actor removed from a production simply because she personally disliked him, and the method she used to achieve it was to stage a fainting episode in the middle of the set. The fake collapse halted the entire production for 10 full hours and applied enough pressure on the producer that the actor was eventually let go. Lancaster wrote that Wood created an atmosphere of fear on every set she worked on, where people understood that crossing her could mean the end of their careers or something worse. The most striking part of what Lancaster wrote about Wood involved the circumstances of her death in 1981, when she drowned after falling from a yacht off the coast of Catalina Island. The official verdict was accidental drowning, but Lancaster hinted in his journal that the truth was more complicated, suggesting that her death was in some way connected to the dangerous web of relationships and schemes she had constructed over the years. A journalist from The Hollywood Reporter reportedly noted that just weeks before her death, Wood had allegedly threatened to destroy the career of a close associate if they refused to do what she demanded. Lancaster's own summary of her life and death was bleak and unsparing. He wrote that the sea had not killed her, it had only hidden what she had already left behind on shore. The third name was Mickey Rooney, and here the contrast between public face and private reality was almost difficult to process. Rooney had spent decades being one of Hollywood's most reliably cheerful and approachable personalities, the kind of entertainer who seemed to genuinely enjoy making people happy. Lancaster's journal described something entirely different. According to what he wrote, Rooney was a verbal sadist who took active pleasure in humiliating people who had less power than he did. On set, he would openly mock background actors in front of the entire crew, targeting trivial things like their hairstyle or the way they were dressed, and watching with visible satisfaction as his targets became visibly distressed. Lancaster wrote that Rooney seemed to enjoy the moment when someone crumbled under his mockery, treating it as a kind of private victory. The cruelty Lancaster described did not stay on the set. He alleged that Rooney's treatment of the women in his personal life was even worse, describing a pattern of control and fear that characterized his marriages. Rooney married 8 times, a fact that many people treated as a charming Hollywood eccentricity. Lancaster's reading of those marriages was considerably darker. He described them as relationships built on domination rather than love, where Rooney methodically broke down his partners until their ability to resist him was gone. One specific incident Lancaster recorded from 1970 alleged that Rooney had physically struck his wife on a film set because she was running behind schedule. Lancaster concluded that the long string of failed marriages was not a story about a romantic man unlucky in love, but a record of repeated domestic abuse. The fourth name was Elizabeth Taylor, who represented a very different kind of power from the others on the list. Taylor was not just famous, she was one of the most commercially valuable and culturally dominant figures in the entire history of Hollywood, and Lancaster's account suggested she knew exactly how to use that position. The specific incident he recorded from the filming of Cleopatra in 1962, one of the most expensive and chaotic productions in Hollywood history, involved Taylor locking herself in her dressing room and refusing to come out because a co-star had appeared on set wearing a dress in the same color as hers. The production ground to a complete halt for 14 hours. When the director finally approached her personally and asked her to return to work, she threw a glass of wine directly into his face. Lancaster wrote that Taylor was not simply a difficult star with a temper, she was a strategic manipulator who used her cultural position to bend the people around her, including some of the most powerful producers in the industry, to her will. Lancaster's account extended into Taylor's personal life, particularly her long and turbulent relationship with Richard Burton. He alleged that Taylor used the relationship not primarily as a romantic partnership, but as a source of leverage, effectively taking control of Burton's career and using their public profile as a couple to shape decisions that suited her own ambitions. Lancaster described her marriages more broadly as calculated transactions rather than love stories, each one designed to consolidate or expand the power she already held.
The fifth name was Spencer Tracy, and this account was among the most disturbing in the journal because of how completely it contradicted the image Tracy had cultivated over a long and celebrated career. Tracy was revered as one of the finest screen actors of his generation, known for performances of quiet depth and apparent moral seriousness. Lancaster's portrait was of a man in whom anger was always present, just beneath a controlled surface, and alcohol was the mechanism that brought it out. He described Tracy's drinking not as a personal weakness or a private struggle, but as something closer to a deliberate tool of intimidation, a way of keeping the people around him in a state of nervous uncertainty about what he might do next. The allegations Lancaster recorded about Tracy included sexual assault and physical abuse committed on set, and a specific incident during the 1961 filming of Judgment at Nuremberg, in which Tracy smashed a liquor bottle against a makeup table because an artist had made a small error in their work. Lancaster also wrote that Tracy used psychological tactics alongside physical ones, including the threat of suicide deployed as a weapon to force co-stars into compliance with what he wanted.
The sixth name was James Stewart, and this one carried a particular kind of shock because Stewart's public image was perhaps the most wholesome and beloved of any actor in American film history. The roles he played, the ordinary, decent man standing up for what was right in films like It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, had made him into something approaching a national symbol of integrity. Lancaster's account described a man who had constructed and protected that image with cold and calculated deliberateness. One of Stewart's alleged habits, according to what Lancaster recorded, was to quietly take note of mistakes made by his co-stars during filming and then pass those observations to the director privately after each shooting day was done. The effect was to create a constant atmosphere of surveillance and judgment on any set he worked on, where other actors felt they were being watched and evaluated in ways they could not see or respond to. Lancaster's account of Stewart went further than professional sabotage. He alleged that in 1957, Stewart refused to work alongside a black actor, but handled the situation in a way designed to avoid any open confrontation that might damage his reputation. Rather than expressing his position directly, he framed the refusal as a technical requirement of the script, leaving others without an obvious point of challenge. Lancaster also alleged that Stewart was willing to use forged documents to discredit actors who had somehow gotten in his way, fabricating evidence that could damage a person's reputation and force them off a production. Lancaster's conclusion was stark. Stewart never needed to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to make an entire room feel diminished. The seventh name was Marilyn Monroe, and here Lancaster's account challenged probably the most emotionally charged public narrative in all of Hollywood history. Monroe has been remembered primarily as a victim, a fragile and beautiful woman destroyed by the pressures and predatory behavior of the industry around her. Lancaster's portrait was of someone who used that perception of fragility as a carefully managed instrument of control. He wrote that Monroe would disappear from sets without warning, leaving entire crews waiting for hours with no explanation, and that this behavior was not a symptom of emotional distress, but a deliberate method of asserting power over the production. During the filming of Some Like It Hot in 1959, this pattern was apparently constant enough that it became a defining feature of the shoot. Lancaster alleged that Monroe's manipulation extended into her personal relationships with powerful men in the industry, describing a situation in 1961 involving film producer Jack Warner in which she staged an emotional breakdown to force him into a professional decision that benefited her at the expense of others. The eighth name was Errol Flynn, remembered by the public as one of Hollywood's most charming and adventurous leading men, the swashbuckling hero of Captain Blood and the Adventures of Robin Hood. Lancaster described someone whose private life was defined by exploitation and abuse on a significant scale. Flynn allegedly hosted gatherings where drugs, hired escorts, and violence mixed together in ways that left participants in no position to speak out about what they had witnessed.
He was said to have used his connections within the industry and beyond to avoid serious consequences, even when his behavior crossed into criminal territory, including reportedly walking free after an arrest for drug trafficking. Lancaster's judgment was direct. Flynn was not a man of questionable personal morals who sometimes made bad decisions. He was, in Lancaster's words, a predator without limits. The ninth name was Bing Crosby, and the specific horror Lancaster described here was domestic rather than professional. Crosby was one of the most popular entertainers in American history, famous for his calm and pleasant manner, his unflappable warmth in every public appearance. Lancaster alleged that behind the closed doors of his home, Crosby subjected his children to cruelty that was both systematic and sustained. The specific incident Lancaster recorded involved Crosby forcing his son to stand shirtless in freezing cold temperatures as punishment for a poor grade at school, telling him that the physical discomfort would teach him what failure felt like. Lancaster alleged that psychological cruelty was accompanied by physical threats and actual violence used to maintain control not just over his children, but over other family members as well. What gave Lancaster's account additional weight was that years later, Bing Crosby's son Gary confirmed much of it in his own memoir, writing that he would rather have been the son of anyone on earth, even a criminal, than of his own father.
The 10th name was Gary Crosby himself, and Lancaster's treatment of him was arguably the most compassionate entry in the entire journal, even as the facts he recorded were deeply troubling. Gary Crosby had been beaten as a child, sometimes with a golf club, and the man he grew into carried the full weight of that damage in visible and destructive ways. Accusations followed him throughout his adult life, including violence against women he was involved with and physical assaults on others over trivial provocations. One incident involved him destroying a film director's windshield because he had not been included in a dinner invitation. Lancaster also alleged involvement in drug use and connections to prostitution rings, but the framework Lancaster placed around all of it was one of tragic inevitability rather than pure condemnation. Gary Crosby, Lancaster wrote, did not know how to love. He only knew how to make people afraid because fear was the only language his father had ever used to communicate with him. The remaining names Lancaster recorded in his journal extended the same basic pattern into different corners of the industry. Henry Fonda, celebrated publicly as a symbol of American decency and moral clarity, was described by Lancaster as emotionally cold and psychologically abusive toward both his family and professional colleagues. Jane Fonda was alleged to have used her fame and her political convictions as weapons to pressure and divide people who stood in opposition to her. Joan Crawford, whose story had already been told in devastating terms by her own daughter, was described by Lancaster as an abusive mother who used violence and controlled substances to dominate her children. And Lucille Ball, whose warm and comedic public image made her one of the most beloved figures in the history of American television, was alleged to have maintained an environment of fear and surveillance in her professional life, keeping detailed records of her employees' mistakes, punishing them severely when those records were used against them, and even installing hidden microphones to monitor conversations among her staff. Lancaster described the journal as a whole as a blood-stained warning, his own final attempt to tell the truth about a world that had spent decades perfecting the art of hiding it. Whether every account he recorded can be fully verified or stands up to the scrutiny of historical investigation is a separate question, but the picture the journal paints of a golden era whose shine was produced in part by very deliberate concealment of what lay underneath is one that has only become more credible with time.